Right guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. It's not even Christmas yet, but the cheating allegations are officially back for 2026. Reports have it that Mercedes, and potentially Red Bull as well, have found a way to generate an extra 15 brake horsepower from their internal combustion engines compared to what any of the other teams have been able to do. Now, that is because of a grey area in the regulations. The other teams are vehemently speaking to the FIA, according to rumours, to shut this loophole down, but Mercedes and maybe Red Bull have found a way to make their engines potentially unstoppable next season. Good news for Max, good news for the 4 teams maybe that are Mercedes powered, or are the FIA going to step in and shut this down? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. We've got a lot to get into today. We're going to start here. If you're a designer, then you can design, if you want to, the trophies for the Madrid Grand Prix. They're actually doing a contest for it. National, international artists, if you want to design the trophies, cook up something better than what we've had at some of the Grand Prix this season, I would suggest. We also have confirmation on the full driver numbers for next year. Lando will take number 1, Oscar, George, Kimi, obviously Max is going to number 33, or number 3 from number 33. But look, a number of these numbers are the same as last year, so I'm not going to go through every single one. But Max is number 3, Lando's number 1, Arvid Lindblad, who's on the grid, is going to take number 41, which I think is a number that hasn't been used since I think like the 80s or something. I saw that, so interesting. Number 41 for Lindblad, Stroll, Alonso, etc, etc. The only other numbers of note, I suppose, here are the 2 returning drivers, that being Sergio Perez and Valtteri Bottas. They will take the numbers that we are used to. So number 11 for Perez, number 77 for Bottas. That is your official entry list for next year. We also have an official date for when Ferrari will launch their car. They come up with a nice little video, 23rd of January 2026, or swap those numbers around if you're watching for the US of A. But Ferrari will be launching their new car. But will it be their new car? So this has been the big discussion. I saw the race did an interesting video on this yesterday, that there's going to be a huge development curve next year. I think Fred Vasseur said that effectively the development curve is vertical. At the start of next season, the changes that are going to be made, and I don't know if those changes that will be made radically as next season goes on will necessarily be, oh, can we add more downforce? I think what it's going to be a lot of next year, and probably the year after as well, with these massively complicated regulations, is managing all of the issues that they bring up. We've talked in the last few days on some detail with regard to the active aero, all of the problems that creates. The teams will need to find good solutions to those problems, and they will run into problems as the season goes on. They will need to solve them. The team that does that the best is probably going to be the team that wins next year's title. Of course, you'll also need to be reliable. Of course, you also need a good engine, and we're going to discuss what that looks like in a second, because the loopholes are not limited to what we talked about yesterday with Adrian Newey apparently finding some idea with regard to the floor. There are engine loopholes, it seems, as well. But the Ferrari piece is interesting because reportedly what they are going to reveal on January the 23rd, they're meant to be doing apparently a debut at Fiorano. So they will have a car on track. The other teams apparently are just going to show liveries online, basically, before that behind closed doors test in Barcelona. But no, they will bring a car to Fiorano with Leclerc and Hamilton, do a few laps. But it is likely to be a Spec A car, as in it will be a very base version of next year's Ferrari that effectively just has the engine in, and apart from that is pretty much just the standard FIA concept that they drove. Now, I'm sure there were going to be some differences there, some ideas that Ferrari have presented, but it's going to be like the Mercedes 2022 car that they showed up with, which had very conventional side pods before they magically vanished when the season began. So it'll be something like that. Now, it does appear that other teams will do this as well. The point is, at the first race of the season, you've got to have got as much data as you can over the previous few testing sessions. And Barcelona, what you really don't want is to have massive reliability issues with whatever complications you're cooking up on the car. So Ferrari, and reportedly other teams as well, I'd be surprised if other teams don't do this. Effectively, what we are going to see at the start of next season, those cars will be aerodynamically nothing like, or certainly nowhere near as advanced as we are expecting when they turn up to Bahrain. They're likely to use a very early version just to ensure that it works, test the active aero, make sure the engine is working, learn as much as you can from that, and then in Bahrain for properly pre-season testing, and then of course in Melbourne for the first Grand Prix. That's when we're going to see further cars. But there are going to be huge changes, I'm sure, between what Ferrari present in January and what they turn up to Melbourne with, and I imagine that other teams will be in a very similar position as well next season. So I guess the early points with regard to this is whatever the numbers might be that come out of Barcelona testing in January, take them with even bigger of a pinch of salt than we normally do. These are the dates we know so far. Ferrari 23rd of January. So either you reveal it before the Barcelona test or you reveal it after. We still don't have dates for the other teams quite as of yet. Speaking of Williams, that we also don't know, they also have a special livery. This is a what do they call it? Flow state. This is the testing livery they're going to be running. There was a competition for designing this. This is what it looks like. I don't know, W or L. Intrigued to your opinion in the comments below. But I'm guessing they mean Barcelona. No, they do mean Barcelona testing. Yeah, I was going to say Bahrain, but of course this isn't broadcast. So maybe they'll be doing some pictures of it at some point. But let's talk about what you came here for, which is the engine-related drama. Mercedes actually came up with this. They announced their new engine sound. I'll put this right at the end of the video, which I said I'd do for Honda the other day, but I forgot. But I will try and remember this time. But what's more important about the engine is not what it sounds like, it's how it performs. Motorsportmagazine.com here from Christian Menath came out with a very remarkable article discussing what they could be cooking up next year. So the engines are very different. It is still a V6 turbo hybrid. The hybrid component is far bigger than it used to be, but the ICE is still very critical. You generate more power from the internal combustion engine, gives you more power to use to charge up the battery, which is effectively what those engines are going to be doing. And we recognize that over the last few years, it's not really been an engine championship, right? It's been much more aero, suspension, operations, all that type of stuff. But back in the day in Formula 1, engines were particularly important, and that will be the case again in 2026, that is for sure. So if you can unlock more performance, why would you not try to? Now, this is apparently what Mercedes and maybe Red Bull are doing as well. The focus is on compression ratio. So, look, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an expert, but I'll explain this as I understand it. Feel free to give your perspective and corrections in the comment section below. One manufacturer has apparently found a way to circumvent the stipulated compression ratio. To facilitate Audi and powertrain's entry, several changes to the ICE were made for the new regulations. The base engine is relatively unchanged, so it's still a V6 turbo, but it is different. There are some parameters adjusted, including the compression ratio. So the F1 regulations currently allow an 18:1 compression ratio. Now, that is pretty mega. I mean, if you've got a high-performance road car, you might be looking at 10, maybe 12, that kind of ballpark compression ratio. F1 engines, of course, are different gravy. As we know, they generate a lot of horsepower. But next year, that will go from 18:1 down to just 16:1. I say just 16, it's still a big number. But it is significantly lower than it used to be, and the level of thermal efficiency that you can therefore generate from a given amount of fuel is reduced. And, well, some teams aren't very happy about allowing that to, let's say, continue unchecked. So the compression ratio, imagine you've got a cylinder. I mean, that is the cylinder in the engine. You've got an air-fuel mixture in the cylinder, and you're going to compress it with the piston. That existing volume that starts out in the cylinder compared to the remaining volume after it's compressed, pretty straightforward. That's your compression ratio, as I say. Sometimes 10:1 in some high-performance cars. In F1, we've been looking at 18:1. Those are mega numbers, challenging to accomplish, but with incredibly advanced engineering, it is possible to use 18:1 compression and actually harness all of the energy from it. Now, it has come to light that while next year they're only going to be 16:1, it is possible to actually get 18:1 anyway. Mercedes and possibly Red Bull powertrains, and I'm sure that Max fans and Red Bull fans will be happy to hear that Red Bull once again have cheating allegations to their name, because, it's also worth saying loads of the Mercedes engineers on the Mercedes powertrains project were stolen by Horner, effectively, to go to Red Bull powertrains. So there are similar heads in those departments on some level, but they found a way, apparently, to increase compression ratio during operation. So, of course, when the engine is tested, when it's checked with, let's say a tape measure, whatever, I'm sure they use something far more advanced than that, but it will show that it's only 16-1 compression. But actually, when it's running, when it's hot, they might be able to find ways to go higher than that. So there's document 042, it's an addendum to the regulations by which compression ratio is determined. The engines should not exceed the permitted ratio of 16-1, but in operation, they could find a way through this trick to get to 18-1. So effectively, this involves using different materials that expand in different ways when heated. So you would be able to, it's 16-1 when it's static, but if you have the certain materials, such as, let's say, the piston would expand more than the actual casing itself, then when it's hot, potentially that piston, because it was bigger, would compress more, right? And therefore you would be able to generate more power. I think generating more power is not precisely correct, but it's just the more you compress it, the more energy you're able to recover from the fuel, so the more efficient you can be. Because in F1, as we know, it's a fuel flow limited engine. So you're only allowed to put a certain amount of fuel into the engine at one time. So you can't just pump it with more fuel to generate more power, as, well, we think Ferrari might have tried that in 2019, tricking the sensor. That was all the talk about fuel flow rate. Assuming that you can no longer do that, then the way to generate more power from the engine from the same given amount of fuel is to increase the compression. You can therefore harness more of the energy in the fuel if you compress it further. Now, a fair question might be, okay, why weren't teams doing this right now, right? In the last few years, why haven't teams been pushing from 18-1 up to, let's say, 20-1? But for the research I did on this, it appears that there's definitely a diminishing return once you get it. And there was a reason why 18-1 was chosen as the compression ratio, because given all the materials and everything else that was stipulated in the previous iteration, that was effectively the optimal and really the highest number you could realistically go to. If you try and get to a higher compression ratio than that with everything that Formula 1 cars are currently using, you'd probably have to slow down the timing of the sparks and all this. So it seems like there's very much so a diminishing return above 18-1. So no team's really tried. But teams do know that 18-1 it works, and as I say, it's basically the same engines with the same components. They're just mandating only 16-1 because effectively that helps Audi really and the newcomers, because they're going to struggle to achieve the 18-1 compression ratio. But of course, Mercedes aren't going to say, well, okay, we're happy to go down to 16-1. If they can find a way to gain some performance advantage, they are going to try to do it. Now, of course, Mercedes are going to say, well, look, our engine is perfectly fine at a static load test, which is effectively very reminiscent of what we've talked about with flexi wings over the last couple of years. When at speed, the wing will flex more than is allowed, but on a static load test, it's fine. Look, this is F1, baby. This is the genius of the engineers that work in these teams. This is what makes the sport so fascinating. But again, it's not just that. It's also the politics, right? Like, this is just everything that I love about Formula 1 in many respects. So Ferrari, Honda, and Audi are saying, well, hang on a second, lads. Like, this shouldn't be allowed. Because in Article C1.5, prefaced in the regulations, says Formula 1 cars must comply fully with these regulations at all times during a competition, which again is the same argument as flexi wings. But what are you going to do about it? It's a good question. How can you prove what is happening when the engine is actually running? So again, actually the article does mention that, the relationship to the flexibility of components. The FIA now uses special markings and cameras to monitor that deformation. But with the engine, it's like, how do you do it, right? Even though the dimensions are more precisely defined, they change during operation. Like the connecting rods lengthen slightly due to the enormous forces, for example. So how do you deal with that? It's a problem to measure it, and as a result, this trick may be allowed, right? What are the FIA going to do to shut this down? Especially because it's not far away from 2026 being here, not far away from the first few tests to happen, and there's so many other complications of these regulations that the FIA have to think about as well. Others think the trick is new. Some believe that, the competition is trying to preemptively argue its case should Mercedes once again be miles ahead. So maybe they're not actually doing it, but if they do appear to be miles ahead, the other teams are saying, oh, well, make sure you look at Mercedes to see what they're doing. So they've come up with an explanation as to why they might be so far ahead anyway. So maybe they're not doing this. A little bit of explanation here on why going above 18-1 with the octane rating of the fuel would have been challenging to really generate any more thermal thermal efficiency. Exactly how the trick works is unclear. It involves the expansion of certain components, so we kind of talked about that earlier. It's not so clear. The FIA say the issue will continue to be discussed in technical forums with the engine manufacturers. So there's clearly something going on to a certain extent. But how much performance would this generate, right? Because dealing with this issue now, let's say they allow this. I mean, and again, how can they not allow it? Because Mercedes can say, oh, well, it's fine. We comply with the rules. What are you going to do? Like have sensors in our cylinders in real time during the Grand Prix? I mean, it just... yeah, it would be a problem, would it not, to manage? And also very challenging for any others to catch up, because as is described, if you are running at a higher effective compression ratio, you need stronger pistons, connecting rods. These other components need to be manufactured in a different way to compensate for an 18-to-1 compression. So it's not something that the teams will easily be able to catch up to. The bottom line is this trick is estimated to increase the horsepower yielded by around 15 horsepower. And that is pretty substantial, actually, because the horsepower of these new engines is no longer 850, it's now about 500, roughly, about 550, something like that, from the new internal combustion engines, because they're going 55-45 next year. So a 15 horsepower gain is a substantial percentage increase on what the ICE generates. And, you know, we tend to talk about it, let's say a 10 kilogram reduction in car weight is about 3/10 in lap time. A 15 horsepower addition is also roughly 3/10 of lap time, which, again, could be a waiver protest. That's what the article discusses. A little bit more talk here going on about the fuel flow rates of what you can currently have going into the engine and what that's going to be going forward, which is substantially reduced, which is why this compression ratio is such an important statistic effectively, and why it's more relevant now arguably than it has been over the last 10-12 years. So are we going to turn up to Melbourne and have a ton of protests from other teams on the strength of the Mercedes power unit? And are Red Bull also getting involved in the trick as well? I think it's good to hear that it's not just Mercedes, right? Like, if it was just Mercedes who had found this, I mean, first of all, they would have no one else in their corner, but equally they would have McLaren, Alpine, and Williams in their corner, I suppose, when it comes to if those guys were also going to enjoy a 15 horsepower engine advantage. But if it's Red Bull as well, then, you know, you've got basically half the teams. I mean, over half the teams, because Red Bull are also supplying Red Bull powertrains to Racing Bulls. So, in fact, it would be Ferrari and Haas, Ferrari powered, it would be Aston Martin, Honda powered, and it would be, you know, obviously Cadillac, I suppose, Ferrari powered, and then Audi, Sauber with their own engine. They're 5, but there's 6 that might be doing it. So, I don't know, very interesting. But if this does mean that everyone else is cooked, right, and there's just no way they're going to be able to compete with the power that the Mercedes is going to be outputting, and of course there are 4 teams that benefit from that engine, then, yeah, it could be in for an interesting season. Look, we're going to be in for an interesting season regardless. And tweet your thoughts on all that in the comments below. Hopefully I explained that reasonably well. Just going to close out the video with this. So, Autosport came out with their top 50 drivers of 2025. These are the top 50. In fact, these are the full top 50. Again, I do feel to some degree for the people that tried to put this together, because it's unbelievably challenging to do this across all the motorsport disciplines, to try and come up with a list of the 50 best drivers in the world. I don't follow all the different motorsports, so there are certain names that I'm sure you guys are looking at and saying, I can't believe that they've put him there over this guy, that I may not be able to have an opinion on so much. I will say, when we go right to the top of the list, Max Verstappen number 1, Russell number 2. I think Russell was the second best driver this season in Formula 1, but I think that you could argue that Alex Palou could even be number 1 on this list, right? Like, if there was any year where Alex Palou could have been the number 1 driver considered on the planet, I think it probably would have been this year. Again, Verstappen's exploits this season were so legendary, and his own admission, he thinks this was his best ever year in Formula 1. You know, obviously you can absolutely justify Max being number 1, and I think that's what I would do as well. I think I would put Max number 1 on this list. That's what they have done, but I think I'd have to put Palou second, because his season this year in IndyCar was unbelievable. Outside of like one DNF where he got classified, his average finishing position was basically seconds in what is effectively a spec series. Like, this was an unbelievable season that Alex Palou had this year in IndyCar. So yeah, if there was ever going to be a time, but look, they've put him third, not too much criticism on that, I guess, on my side. Kind of interesting to see how they've listed the F1 drivers. So Verstappen, Russell, Leclerc, Norris, Piastri. So Norris, 6th best driver of the year. They think Leclerc over both Norris and Piastri is definitely interesting. I think it's justifiable. Robert Kubica in 8th. As I say, I would probably have Norris above Leclerc personally, but yeah, intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hulkenberg was the next best placed F1 driver, then Gasly, then Hadjar. So yeah, Gasly up in 12th I thought was, you know, I can see the vision. I think Gasly did a fine job this year, but for him to be up in 12th feels, especially when you've got like Sainz in 38th, Albon in 39th, that feels a little bit off to me. I mean, Dan Ticktum is ahead of both Sainz and Albon, which I thought was pretty interesting. You know, Kyle Larson's at 15th, Antonelli at 18th. Some other notable names, I mean, arguably Kevin Estre should have been higher than this. Felipe Nasr, Pato Award. We've also got a Yuma Iwasa I thought was interesting because he was in Formula 2, but then they sent him off to Super Formula. And I think he's done a good job in Super Formula, but I was a little bit surprised to see him so high on the list, I thought. But intrigued to your thoughts on that. Some other notable names, you know, Rovan Perez we know is coming over, Leonardo Fordaroli from the junior formulas, Pierre Guidi, some other great names on this list. And yeah, Hamilton does make it in 47th, just ahead of Ollie Behrman. It's pretty interesting, as I say, if you go through the F1 drivers, you might argue, well, you know, I think Hamilton is probably a conversation to have, but like Alonso should probably be here, right? Like if Hamilton's going to be here, I think Alonso should probably be here. But yeah, intrigued to your thoughts on all of that stuff as ever in the comment section below. I'm actually not going to walk through this line by line because, again, I just think there's too much rage bait. So I'm just going to present this without comment. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.